in the early morning hours of December 17, 1995, in a small logging town nestled between the Cascade Mountains and Puget Sound, a young mother named Rebecca Ann Hollister vanished from her own bedroom while her 2 children slept down the hall. Her husband reported her missing at 7:43 that morning, his voice steady on the recorded emergency line, describing how he had woken to find her side of the bed empty and cold. The front door stood slightly ajar. Her purse remained on the kitchen counter. Her winter coat hung by the entrance. In the decades that followed, investigators would return again and again to a single, chilling question. How does a woman disappear from a locked house in the middle of winter, leaving no footprints in the fresh snow that had fallen throughout that December night? Port Hadley sat where the mountains met the water, a town of 4,000 souls who made their living from the timber industry and the fishing boats that returned each evening with the tide. The houses climbed the hillsides in irregular rows, their paint weathered by constant rain and salt air. In December, darkness came early and stayed late. Fog rolled in from the Sound each night, thick enough to muffle sound and obscure the streetlights that lined the main road through town. The winters were long. The community was tight-knit in the way that isolated places often are, where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were hard to keep but harder still to speak aloud. Rebecca Ann Hollister was 28 years old that December. Those who knew her described a woman with auburn hair she wore in a practical braid, a quick smile, and hands that were always busy. She worked 3 mornings a week at the elementary school cafeteria, not because the family needed the money particularly, but because she liked being around the children and the other mothers. She had grown up 2 towns over, met her husband Thomas Hollister at a church social when she was 19, married him 6 months later. They had 2 children, Emma, who was 7 that year, and Michael, who had just turned 4 in November. The Hollisters lived on Pinecrest Road, a narrow street that dead-ended at the National Forest boundary. Their house was a modest 2-story structure with blue siding and white trim, set back from the road behind a row of Douglas firs that Thomas had planted the year Emma was born. A wooden swing hung from the oak tree in the front yard. A vegetable garden, dormant now in winter, occupied the sunny patch beside the driveway. Neighbors later recalled that the house always looked well-maintained, the lawn kept neat, the gutters clean. Thomas worked as a shift supervisor at the lumber mill on the edge of town, a position he had held for 6 years. He was known as a quiet man, religious, someone who kept his family affairs private. December 16, 1995 was a Sunday. Rebecca had taken the children to the 9 o'clock service at Port Hadley Community Church, while Thomas stayed home, saying he had paperwork to catch up on for the mill. The pastor remembered seeing Rebecca that morning, remembered her saying hello, remembered young Michael tugging at her skirt during the final hymn. After church, she stopped at the Safeway on Harbor Street to pick up groceries for the week. The checkout clerk, a teenage girl named Jennifer who had gone to school with Rebecca's younger sister, later told investigators that Rebecca had seemed normal, maybe a little tired. But that was nothing unusual for a mother of 2 young children in the weeks before Christmas. Rebecca returned home around 11:30. The rest of the day unfolded in the ordinary rhythms of family life. She made grilled cheese sandwiches for lunch. The children played in the backyard while she folded laundry. Around 3 in the afternoon, Thomas's brother Daniel stopped by to borrow a socket wrench set. He stayed for maybe 20 minutes, had a cup of coffee, chatted about the upcoming holiday plans. Daniel would later tell deputies that Rebecca and Thomas seemed fine, normal, no tension that he could detect. The children watched a video on the television. Rebecca started preparing dinner around 5, a pot roast with carrots and potatoes that she put in the oven to cook slowly. The family ate dinner together at 6:15. Thomas had insisted on family dinners, no television, everyone at the table. Afterward, Rebecca gave the children their baths. She read to them from a picture book about a bear who couldn't sleep through winter. The book was found later on the nightstand in Michael's room, a bookmark placed 3/4 through. Emma and Michael were in bed by 8:30, the house settling into evening quiet. The last verified sighting of Rebecca Ann Hollister was at approximately 9 o'clock when a neighbor named Patricia Drummond, walking her dog past the Hollister house, saw Rebecca through the kitchen window, washing dishes at the sink. By 9:45, lights were off throughout most of the house. The porch light remained on, as it did every night. Thomas would later state that he and Rebecca had watched the late news together in their bedroom, that she had seemed fine, perhaps a bit quiet but nothing that concerned him. He said they went to bed around 10:30. He said he fell asleep quickly. He said he woke at 6:45 the next morning to discover her gone. The 911 call came in at 7:43 on Monday morning, December 17. The dispatcher, a woman named Carol Henderson who had worked the emergency line for 15 years, preserved the recording. Thomas's voice on that recording was calm, almost flat. He explained that his wife was missing. He explained that her car was still in the garage. He explained that the front door was open, which was strange because they always locked it at night. Carol asked if there were signs of a struggle. Thomas said no. Carol asked what Rebecca had been wearing. Thomas said he didn't know, maybe her nightgown. He couldn't remember what color it was. 2 deputies arrived at the Hollister house at 7:58. They found Thomas in the kitchen, already dressed for work in his mill uniform, a flannel shirt and work boots. The children were still asleep. Thomas showed the deputies through the house. The bedroom showed no signs of disturbance. The bed was made. Rebecca's nightgown was folded on top of the hamper in the bathroom, along with the clothes she had worn the day before. The deputies noted this detail carefully. If she had changed out of her nightgown, where were the clothes she changed into? Thomas said he didn't know. He said maybe she was wearing something from the closet, but he couldn't say what was missing. The front door lock showed no signs of tampering. Thomas explained that he had found the door standing open perhaps 6 inches when he woke up. He said it must not have latched properly when he locked it the night before. He demonstrated how the old lock sometimes failed to catch if you didn't pull the door tight. The deputies tested the mechanism. It worked fine. They looked at each other but said nothing. Then came the detail that would haunt every subsequent conversation about that morning. Sometime after midnight, snow had begun falling across Port Hadley. Not a heavy snow, but steady, the kind that accumulates quietly through the dark hours. By dawn, roughly 3 inches covered the ground. The deputies stood on the front porch and looked at the steps, at the walkway, at the driveway beyond. Snow lay undisturbed. No footprints led away from the house in any direction. The wooden swing hung perfectly still under its coating of white. The toy truck that Michael had left in the yard lay on its side, half buried. If Rebecca Hollister had walked out that door, she had left no trace of her passing. The search began in earnest by mid-morning. Sheriff's deputies were joined by volunteers from the town, from the church, from Thomas's co-workers at the mill. They formed lines and walked through the forest behind the house, calling Rebecca's name. The temperature hovered just below freezing. More snow began falling around noon, covering whatever traces might have existed. Search dogs were brought in from Seattle, arriving by late afternoon. The dogs showed interest in the front door area, but refused to follow any trail beyond the porch. Their handlers reported that this typically meant either there was no scent trail to follow, or the scent ended abruptly at that location. By evening of the first day, over 200 people had joined the search. The elementary school closed early so teachers could help. Local businesses shut their doors. The fire department brought portable lights to continue searching after dark. Television news crews arrived from Seattle and Tacoma. Rebecca's photograph appeared on the evening broadcasts, smiling from what looked like a family portrait, her auburn hair catching the light, her expression open and hopeful. The phone number for the sheriff's department scrolled across the bottom of the screen. The story led with the mystery of the snow, the impossible absence of footprints, the question no one could answer. Part 2. The search operation expanded over the following week. State police joined the effort. The Coast Guard sent boats to check the shoreline and the waters of Puget Sound. Divers went down in the marinas and along the rocky beaches. Helicopter crews flew grid patterns over the forest. Every abandoned building in the county was searched. Every vacant lot was walked. Every well and cistern was checked. Rebecca's photograph appeared on telephone poles and store windows throughout the region. A tip line was established. Hundreds of calls came in. None led anywhere. Those who knew Thomas Hollister said he appeared to be holding up as well as could be expected under the circumstances. He took time off from the mill. His brother Daniel moved in to help with the children. Thomas participated in the searches, walking the forest trails, calling his wife's name alongside the volunteers. He gave interviews to the television reporters, appealing for information, asking Rebecca to come home if she could hear him, asking anyone who knew anything to please contact the authorities. His composure during these interviews struck some observers as remarkable. Others found it admirable, a man keeping himself together for the sake of his children. Deputies began the careful process of interviewing everyone who had seen Rebecca in the days before her disappearance. The picture that emerged was of a woman well-liked but somewhat isolated. She had friends at the church and among the other cafeteria workers at the school, but no close confidants. Her sister lived 3 hours away and spoke to her perhaps once every 2 weeks. Her parents had both passed away before Emma was born. Those who knew her described someone quiet, devoted to her children, perhaps a little sad sometimes, but nothing that raised alarm. Several mentioned that Thomas preferred Rebecca to focus on home and family rather than social activities. This was framed as traditional values, the way some families chose to live. The investigation began to focus on the timeline. Deputies constructed a detailed accounting of December 16. Rebecca at church in the morning, Rebecca at the grocery store, Rebecca home with the children through the afternoon, Daniel Hollister's visit, the family dinner, the neighbor seeing Rebecca at the kitchen window at 9 o'clock. After that, only Thomas's account of the evening. He said they had watched television together. He said they had gone to bed. He said he had slept through the night without waking. Investigators noted these statements but kept their observations quiet. Physical evidence was sparse. Rebecca's purse contained her wallet with $43, her driver's license, family photographs. Her winter coat hung in the closet. Her boots stood by the door. Investigators found no signs of packing, no missing luggage, no indication that she had planned to leave. In the bedroom, crime scene technicians processed every surface. They found nothing unusual. The bed had been made so thoroughly that it was difficult to determine which side anyone had slept on. Thomas explained that he had made the bed that morning, a habit from his years in the military before settling in Port Hadley. Clear's throat, the matter of the locked door, troubled the investigators. They interviewed Thomas multiple times about this detail. He maintained that he had locked the door before bed, as he did every night. He maintained that he must not have pulled it quite tight enough for the latch to catch. The deputies tested this theory extensively. They found that the door could indeed be opened from the outside, without a key, if the latch hadn't engaged properly. But they also found that this required the door to be in a very specific position, and even then, it would swing open immediately rather than remaining closed through the night. Thomas suggested that perhaps the wind had pushed it open at some point. The deputies noted that there had been no wind that night, only the still, steady snowfall. Investigators questioned Thomas about his marriage. He described a happy relationship, no problems, no arguments. They asked about finances. He said they were comfortable, not wealthy but making ends meet, no unusual debts or pressures. They asked if Rebecca had seemed depressed or anxious. He said no more than any mother of young children, just normal stress, nothing concerning. They asked if she had mentioned wanting to leave or needing time away. Thomas said absolutely not, that Rebecca loved her family, that she would never abandon their children. The children were interviewed carefully by specialists trained in speaking with young witnesses. Emma, at 7 years old, could describe the previous day in some detail. She remembered her mother making lunch. She remembered playing outside. She remembered dinner and bath time and the story about the bear. She said she had gone to sleep and not woken until morning. She said she didn't hear anything unusual during the night. 4-year-old Michael could provide less detail but confirmed the general outline. Both children showed signs of distress and confusion, but nothing that suggested they knew more than they were saying. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about inconsistencies that troubled them. Thomas had said he woke at 6:45 and immediately noticed Rebecca missing, but he hadn't called 911 until 7:43, nearly an hour later. When asked about this gap, Thomas explained that he had searched the house first, had checked the garage and the backyard, had looked to see if perhaps she had gone for an early morning walk despite the snow. Deputies found this explanation reasonable on the surface, but puzzling in its specifics. Why would a man whose wife had vanished in the middle of the night waste an hour searching the property before calling for help? The neighbor, Patricia Drummond, was interviewed multiple times. She confirmed seeing Rebecca through the kitchen window around 9 o'clock on the evening of December 16. She described Rebecca's posture at the sink, washing dishes, her movements normal and unhurried. Patricia said she hadn't thought anything of it at the time. She walked past the Hollister house every evening at about that time with her dog. She often saw Rebecca through the windows, going about evening tasks. There was nothing unusual about that particular night, except that it would be the last time anyone besides Thomas claimed to have seen Rebecca alive. Investigators obtained Thomas's phone records. No unusual calls appeared in the weeks before Rebecca's disappearance. They obtained bank records. No unusual withdrawals or deposits. They searched both vehicles. Rebecca's car, a 10-year-old sedan, showed normal wear and nothing suspicious. Thomas's truck, a newer model he used for his commute to the mill, was clean and well-maintained. Deputies noted the mileage, 72,341 miles. They photographed the odometer. This detail would matter later, though no one knew it yet. The mill where Thomas worked was located 8 miles outside town, a facility that operated 3 shifts around the clock. Thomas worked the day shift, 7 in the morning until 3:30 in the afternoon, Monday through Friday. Investigators interviewed his coworkers and supervisors. Everyone described Thomas as reliable, punctual, competent at his job. Some mentioned that he kept to himself, didn't socialize much with other workers, ate lunch alone most days. This was presented as neither good nor bad, simply his personality. The mill supervisor confirmed that Thomas had called in on Monday morning, December 17, to report that he wouldn't be coming to work due to a family emergency. As days passed into weeks, the investigation began to slow. Every lead had been followed. Every witness had been interviewed. The physical evidence, what little existed, had been processed and analyzed. The searches had covered hundreds of square miles. The tip line continued to receive calls, but nothing substantive emerged. Rebecca Ann Hollister had simply vanished, as though she had never existed at all. Investigators were left with a locked house, no footprints in the snow, no evidence of foul play, and a husband who seemed almost too calm about the disappearance of his wife. The case remained open, but active investigation wound down by February. Deputies continued to follow up on occasional tips. The search parties stopped. The television cameras moved on to other stories. Life in Port Hadley gradually returned to its normal rhythms, though the question of what had happened to Rebecca Hollister lingered in conversations and in the back of people's minds. Part 3. The silence. By spring of 1996, Thomas and the children had developed new routines. Emma attended 2nd grade. Michael started preschool. Thomas's sister, Judith, moved to Port Hadley from Oregon to help with childcare. She was younger than Thomas by 6 years, unmarried, a schoolteacher who had taken a leave of absence to help her brother. She moved into the spare bedroom upstairs. The house on Pinecrest Road functioned, maintained its schedules, appeared from the outside to be coping as well as could be expected. Those who knew the family during this period would later speak of the strangeness that permeated everything. The children seemed subdued, quieter than they had been. Emma developed nightmares and began sleeping with the light on. Michael started drawing pictures that disturbed his preschool teachers, images of people with missing pieces, houses with doors that led nowhere. When asked about these drawings, Michael would simply shrug. He was 4 years old. He couldn't articulate what he felt or what he knew. Judith noticed things she didn't speak about immediately. She noticed that Thomas never mentioned Rebecca's name in front of the children. When Emma or Michael asked about their mother, Thomas would say that she had gone away and might not be coming back. He didn't say missing. He didn't say searching. He said gone away, as though Rebecca had made a choice, as though her absence was intentional. Judith found this strange but told herself that everyone processed grief differently, that Thomas was doing his best under impossible circumstances. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the cold weight of questions you don't want to ask, who have lived with suspicions that feel like betrayal to even acknowledge, the situation Judith found herself in was impossibly difficult. She loved her brother. She had known him all his life. But there were moments during that spring and summer, small incidents that accumulated like snowfall, that made her wonder about things she didn't want to wonder about. There was the way Thomas had boxed up all of Rebecca's belongings within weeks of her disappearance. Not just clothes, but photographs, mementos, anything that showed her face or spoke of her existence. When Judith asked about this, Thomas said it was too painful for the children to be reminded constantly. Judith understood this reasoning but found the thoroughness disturbing. Every trace of Rebecca had been erased from the visible life of the house. There was the time in June when Emma, playing in the backyard, found one of her mother's earrings in the garden soil. She brought it inside, holding it carefully, asking if she could keep it. Thomas took the earring from Emma's hand and said no, that it needed to go away with the other things. Emma cried. Judith watched Thomas's face as he put the earring in his pocket. She saw no emotion there, no recognition of his daughter's grief, only a kind of blank determination. There was the evening in August when Judith couldn't sleep and came downstairs for water. Thomas was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, just sitting, staring at nothing. Judith asked if he was all right. Thomas said he was fine. Then he said something that Judith would remember years later. He said, "Sometimes people make you do things you don't want to do." Judith asked what he meant. Thomas looked at her and said, "Nothing. I'm just tired. Go back to bed." The marriage that had never formally existed between Thomas and Rebecca had dissolved months before her disappearance, though only Thomas seemed to know it. Years later, when investigators could piece together the full picture, they would discover that Thomas had been planning to leave Rebecca, had consulted a lawyer about divorce in October 1995. The lawyer would confirm that Thomas had seemed agitated, had spoken about feeling trapped, had said things about Rebecca that suggested anger beneath his calm exterior. But in December 1995, no one knew about these consultations. Thomas had kept his plans private. By winter of 1997, 2 years after Rebecca's disappearance, the case was effectively cold. No new leads had emerged. No body had been found. The investigation file remained open, but no detectives were actively working it. Rebecca's sister had given up hope. The church had held a memorial service, though Thomas hadn't attended, saying it felt premature when there was still a chance she might return. The community had moved on. Port Hadley kept living, kept working, kept turning through its seasons. But Emma hadn't forgotten. At 9 years old now, she asked questions her father couldn't answer satisfactorily. She asked why they never looked for Mommy anymore. She asked why Daddy had thrown away all of Mommy's pictures. She asked why no one talked about what had really happened that night. Thomas would tell her to stop asking questions, that it upset everyone, that they needed to accept what they couldn't change. Emma stopped asking her father, but she didn't stop wondering. Part 4. The revelation. The break in the case came in September 2008, nearly 13 years after Rebecca Hollister vanished. Emma was 20 years old by then, a junior at Washington State University studying criminal justice. She had left Port Hadley after high school and rarely returned. Michael was 17, living with Judith in a small apartment near Seattle, having moved out of his father's house at 16. The family had fractured completely. Thomas lived alone in the house on Pinecrest Road, still working at the mill, still maintaining the property, still keeping his silence. Emma had spent those 13 years becoming someone her father hadn't anticipated. She had researched her mother's case obsessively. She had read every newspaper article, every police report she could obtain through public records requests. She had taught herself to recognize the patterns of deception, the ways that guilty people behaved versus innocent ones. And she had come to a conclusion that she could no longer ignore. In September 2008, Emma contacted the Snohomish County Sheriff's Department. She asked to speak to someone about her mother's case. She was connected with Detective Sarah Brennan, who had recently transferred to the Cold Case Unit. Emma told Detective Brennan that she needed to tell someone what she remembered from that night in December 1995. Things she hadn't understood when she was 7 years old, but that had come back to her over the years in fragments and nightmares. Emma said she remembered waking in the night. She remembered hearing voices, her mother's voice and her father's voice, not shouting but intense, the kind of argument adults have when they're trying not to wake children. She remembered her mother saying, "I can't do this anymore." She remembered her father's voice saying, "Then you're not leaving me any choice." Emma said she had gotten out of bed and crept to her doorway. She remembered seeing the hallway light on. She remembered starting toward the stairs. Then she remembered nothing else until morning. Detective Brennan listened carefully. She asked Emma why she hadn't mentioned this before. Emma explained that she had told the child specialist who interviewed her in December 1995, but the specialist had seemed to think Emma was confused, mixing up different nights, creating memories from stress and fear. Emma had been 7. The adults told her she was mistaken. She had believed them or at least stopped insisting. But now at 20, studying criminal justice, reading her mother's case file, she knew what she had heard was real. Clear's throat. Detective Brennan reopened the investigation officially on October 3, 2008. She began by reviewing every piece of evidence collected in December 1995. She re-interviewed everyone who had been questioned at the time. She discovered things that earlier investigators had noted but not pursued. The hour gap between Thomas waking and calling 911, the unusual cleanliness of the crime scene, the complete absence of any trace of Rebecca's departure, the fact that Thomas had made the bed that morning, potentially destroying evidence. Then Detective Brennan returned to the detail about Thomas's truck. The mileage recorded in December 1995 had been 72,341 miles. She obtained Thomas's vehicle maintenance records. In January 1996, 6 weeks after Rebecca's disappearance, Thomas had taken the truck for an oil change. The service station's records showed mileage of 72,784 miles. In 6 weeks, Thomas had driven 443 miles beyond his normal commute to the mill. Detective Brennan calculated distances. The mill was 8 miles from Thomas's house. Round trip 16 miles per day, 5 days a week. For 6 weeks, that would account for approximately 480 miles. But people run errands, drive to stores, visit family. 443 miles of unexplained driving in 6 weeks wasn't conclusive of anything, unless you knew where Thomas had driven during that time and why those trips had never been mentioned. In February 2009, Detective Brennan made a decision. She brought Michael Hollister in for an interview. He was 18 now, no longer a child. She asked him about his memories of his mother, of that December night, of the years that followed. Michael was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I knew she didn't leave us. I always knew." Michael described living with his father after Rebecca disappeared. He described the silence, the way Thomas never spoke her name, the way any mention of her was met with anger or cold dismissal. Michael said that when he was 12, he had asked his father directly what had happened to Mom. Thomas had looked at him and said, "Your mother made choices that had consequences. That's all you need to know." Michael said he had understood in that moment that his father knew exactly what had happened, and that the knowing itself was a kind of confession. The investigation focused entirely on Thomas Hollister now. Detective Brennan obtained search warrants for the house on Pinecrest Road, for Thomas's vehicle, for his financial records going back to 1995. A team of forensic specialists descended on the property in March 2009. They used ground-penetrating radar in the backyard, in the vegetable garden, under the oak tree with the wooden swing. They dismantled sections of the basement. They pulled up floorboards. They searched for any indication that Rebecca Hollister had never left that house, that she had been there all along. The search found nothing. The property yielded no forensic evidence, no remains, no hidden grave. Thomas watched the searchers from his kitchen window and said nothing. When Detective Brennan asked him to explain the gaps in his story, the inconsistencies in his timeline, Thomas said he had already answered these questions 13 years ago. He said he wanted a lawyer. The search concluded. Thomas remained free. Then came the testimony that changed everything. In June 2009, a man named Robert Chen contacted Detective Brennan. Chen had worked at the mill with Thomas in the mid-1990s. He had moved to California in 1998 and only recently learned through mutual acquaintances that Rebecca Hollister's case had been reopened. Chen said he needed to tell someone about a conversation he had with Thomas in January 1996. Chen described working a Saturday overtime shift with Thomas. They had been alone in a section of the mill during a meal break. Thomas had seemed agitated, unusual for someone normally so controlled. Chen asked if everything was all right. Thomas said, "If you ever needed to make something disappear permanently, really permanently, how would you do it?" Chen had thought Thomas was speaking hypothetically. He had said, as a joke, "Throw it in the pulper. Nothing survives that." The pulper was the machine that broke down wood chips and other materials into pulp for papermaking. It was industrial strength, capable of reducing anything organic to liquid slurry. Thomas had looked at Chen and smiled. Then Thomas said, "That's what I thought too." Detective Brennan obtained the mill's work schedules from December 1995. Thomas had not worked on December 17, the day Rebecca was reported missing. But the mill operated around the clock. Access to the facility was relatively easy for employees, even on their days off. The pulper ran continuously, processing tons of material daily. If something had been added to the pulper outside of normal operations, it would have been destroyed within hours, reduced to pulp, mixed with thousands of gallons of water and wood fiber, eventually processed into paper products that were shipped around the country. The forensic team examined the mill's pulper, but after 13 years, any trace evidence would have been long gone. The machine had processed millions of tons of material since December 1995. There was nothing to find, but the implication was inescapable. If Thomas had used the mill's equipment to dispose of Rebecca's body, it explained why no remains had ever been found. It explained the missing hour before he called 911. It explained the extra mileage on his truck. The mill was 8 miles from the house. A round trip in the early morning hours, returning home to discover his wife missing, would account for 16 miles that wouldn't appear suspicious. On August 12, 2009, Detective Brennan arrested Thomas Hollister at his home. He was charged with second-degree murder. The arrest shocked the community. Many people still believed Thomas was innocent, that he was a grieving husband who had been unfairly targeted by investigators desperate to solve an unsolvable case. Others said they had suspected all along that something about Thomas's behavior had never sat right with them. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either narrative. The trial began in April 2010. The prosecution built its case on circumstantial evidence, on the inconsistencies in Thomas's story, on his unusual behavior, on his access to the mill and the pulper, on Robert Chen's testimony about the conversation in January 1996. The defense argued that none of this proved Thomas had done anything wrong, that circumstantial evidence wasn't enough to convict a man of taking his wife's life when no body had ever been found, when there was no physical proof that Rebecca was even deceased. Emma testified. She described what she had heard that night, the argument, her mother's voice saying she couldn't do this anymore, her father's response. The defense challenged her memory, suggested she had conflated different nights, pointed out that she hadn't mentioned this to investigators until 13 years later. Emma held firm. She said she knew what she had heard. She said she had spent 13 years trying to forget but couldn't. Michael testified. He described growing up with the knowledge that his father was hiding something, that the official story didn't match what he felt in his bones to be true. The defense objected repeatedly, argued that feelings weren't evidence. The judge allowed Michael's testimony to stand, but instructed the jury to consider carefully the difference between suspicion and proof. The jury deliberated for 6 days. On May 7, 2010, they returned a verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. Thomas Hollister showed no reaction when the verdict was read. He stood silent and still, the same composure he had maintained for 14.5 years. He was sentenced to 23 years in prison. During the sentencing hearing, the judge asked if Thomas had anything to say. Thomas declined to make a statement. He maintained his innocence through his lawyer. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Emma and Michael sat in the gallery and cried. Thomas Hollister remains in Washington State Penitentiary as of January 2026. He has never confessed. He has never explained what happened that December night in 1995. Rebecca Ann Hollister's remains have never been found. Her family has no grave to visit, no place to lay flowers, no marker bearing her name. The house on Pinecrest Road was sold in 2011. New families have lived there since. The wooden swing still hangs from the oak tree in the front yard. Closing the case of Rebecca Ann Hollister represents something beyond its specific facts and circumstances. It represents the truth that sometimes answers arrive too late, that justice delayed can still be justice served, that the voices of children who witness things they can't yet understand may eventually become the testimony that changes everything. For Emma and Michael Hollister, now adults building their own lives far from Port Hadley, the conviction of their father offered a kind of resolution, though not the kind anyone would choose. Their mother remains gone. Their childhood was shaped by absence and lies, but the truth at least has been spoken aloud. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.